In the context of Luke Acts, there is every reason to agree that on Shavuot, Pentecost, the Apostle Peter ordered the heart-stricken men of Israel to participate in Israel's eschatological purification that had been publicly endorsed in the temple by Messiah Jesus just 8 weeks earlier. In other words, the apostles continued to perform Israel's eschatological purification with water in the name of Messiah Yeshua, who had endorsed it in the temple. Now, there's no explicit internal evidence in the New Testament that the apostles took Messiah's command in Matthew 28, verse 19, to refer to water baptism. And let me just read the translation of this verse in the Complete Jewish Bible by Dr. David Stern. This is how it reads. Therefore, go and make people from all nations into Talmidim, disciples, immersing them into the reality of the Father, the Son, and the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. Let me read that again. Therefore, go and make people from all nations into Talmidim, immersing them into the reality of the Father, the Son, and the Ruach HaKodesh. This is a little different than what you're all used to. So, in Matthew 28, verse 19, Yeshua is not ordering his Jewish apostles to water baptize Gentiles. Instead, he sent them to transform those first century pagans from their former life of serving the false gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon, and transforming them into a new life, knowing and serving the living God of Israel, the God of all nations, the God of the universe. I'm convinced that Christian civilization has grossly misread what Messiah Yeshua commanded in Matthew 28, verse 19, and has wrongly put words in his mouth that he never intended. In a later video, I'll make more time for Matthew 28, verse 19. Definitely. In any case, back to Luke Acts. The water baptism proclaimed by Peter on Pentecost was not intended for Gentile believers of the nations. There weren't any yet anyway, but at that time there would be later. Now we will certainly look more closely at Acts 10 and 11 in another video to see just what was going on with the Gentile house of Cornelius. Let me just say right now that this is the only passage in the New Testament where we are explicitly told, with no ambiguity, that any Gentiles ever underwent water baptism. The question in this episode is, why did Peter order them to be baptized? Now, we'll answer that more fully in a video lesson specifically about Cornelius' salvation. But, in short, even though the house of Cornelius had just received the eschatological outpouring of the Holy Spirit, Peter thought that these Gentiles should be purified with the end-time washing of Yochanan, just like all Jews turning to Messiah Yeshua repented and were purified by this washing. That's all he had to go on. However, afterward, Peter kept on thinking about this strange sequence of events in the house of Cornelius, and he eventually remembered Messiah Yeshua's parting words that he said in Acts 1, verse 5. John merely purified with water, but you, in this new era of the new covenant, will be purified with the Holy Spirit. Now, I've added a few words here, obviously. That's the short answer, but that's what it essentially means. Yeshua said he recognized that water can only purify the physical body, but in this new age of the new covenant, all of his disciples are called to be directly purified with the Holy Spirit. In all 6 usages of Holy Spirit in the saying that's repeated 6 times, 4 times by John and twice in Acts, once by Yeshua and once by Peter, John said, I baptize with water, he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. And in Acts it says, John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. Each time we're told of being baptized with the Holy Spirit. It doesn't just say Spirit. It says with the Holy Spirit. And for Jews in the first century who were familiar with trying to live a pure life before God in Second Temple days, I just don't think most of you, maybe any of you, can really understand how much of a day-to-day, hour-to-hour chore it was to stay purified before the Lord. That's the facts of the issue. When Jews read that they were going to be baptized with the Holy Spirit, it meant something more than just being immersed in power. We're talking about being purified, transformed, made holy. That's what ultimately that means, being baptized with the Holy Spirit. It means tremendous transformation, being made holy. And that is where Luke's theology starts kicking into high gear. Being baptized with the Holy Spirit means transformed. The first transformation that a person receives upon being baptized, transformed with the Holy Spirit. And that's what the apostles finally came to understand after the Apostle Peter had already baptized the Gentiles with water, unnecessarily. He didn't have to. He did it, but he didn't have to. He just didn't realize what was going on. But Luke did not leave this story undone. He went on. He repeated the salvation story again in Acts chapter 11, which is not merely redundant. He tells it again, but in that telling, Peter doesn't say water baptized the Gentiles. He said, then he remembered, John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. So that's the short answer for this incident in the house of Cornelius. And this short answer to Cornelius' salvation also leads to the second major issue that I've encountered about baptism in the New Testament. Just like in the house of Cornelius, being baptized with the Holy Spirit is a powerful, palpable, standalone event that was always intended for every believer. The powerful, palpable event was intended by the Almighty to continue from Pentecost's outpouring until the return of Messiah Yeshua from heaven at the last trumpet. In the book of Acts, Luke uses the verb baptizein, baptize, both for Yochanan's water purification and for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. In several places in Acts, there is no explicit word that says the people were baptized with water or that Paul baptized anyone, but only that Lydia in her house and the jailer in his house and the Corinthians were baptized. When we realize that Acts 1 verse 5 is the basis for Luke's understanding of receiving the gift of the Holy Spirit in this new era of the new covenant, then there is every reason to conclude that Luke is talking about being baptized with the Holy Spirit, not with water. And these occur, of course, after the great revelation in the house of Cornelius. So in Acts chapter 2, verse 17, Luke records Peter saying, in the last days, plural, I will pour out my Spirit. And he goes on in verse 18, in those days, plural, I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. According to Luke's understanding of what Peter promised those Israelite worshipers on Shavuot, Pentecost, which was the gift of the Holy Spirit, as promised in Joel, it is a continuing promise that continues throughout all the last days, plural. So, let me just say, I'm someone, as a young adult, newly repentant and freshly turned to Jesus Christ for my atonement before the Almighty. One evening, alone in my room, upon reading about the promised gift of receiving power from on high, I humbly and earnestly asked Yeshua to pour out on me his gift of the Holy Spirit for power from on high. Within 2 seconds of asking Yeshua, I began to experience an overwhelming and powerful sensation of surging power, of surging living love, surging through and in and around me. My mouth could not be kept closed, but instead it gushed forth languages I knew not. The most magnificent aspect of this episode was the tremendously powerful sensation of the nearness of the knowing presence of the Almighty that was so indivisibly near me. I had a visionary mental picture of the Almighty and myself looking into each other's eyes and rejoicing over each other's joy in this tremendous, joyous experience. This experience lasted in power, surging power, for 30 minutes. It was overwhelming. So there's every reason for me to read the New Testament in light of my powerful experience and not in the light of so many cessationist Christian denominations that specifically profess lack of spiritual experience. In Titus 3, verses 4 through 7, Paul writes that for him and Titus and all the believers whom he knew, they all had received the rich outpouring of the Holy Spirit that causes regeneration and renewal. In Acts 2, verse 33, Luke uses the same Greek word for Peter, who describes Yeshua, Jesus, outpouring the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. So, does anyone want to try to argue that there's 2 different kinds of outpourings of the Holy Spirit? One on Pentecost, and then another that everybody receives, and they don't know about it? They don't experience anything? You'll have to argue it. I don't see it. It is not an easy word to declare, but the many denominations of Christian civilization, great and small, have failed to rightly divide the word of truth. Baptism is one of the most confused and controversial topics among those who want to follow Messiah Yeshua. And I grant that among all the different denominations. People are trying to serve Messiah Yeshua. So in the course of these videos, I'll be delving into what the New Testament says to try to recover the wishes of Messiah Yeshua. Thank you and many blessings.